I feel like it's going to be the most boring draft ever because of the misses you've had on the offensive line. You haven't neglected it completely. You've tried a little bit,
Yeah.
but even, with the little effort you've put in, it has not panned out. So I think you need to put in a lot of effort on the offensive line. And so that kind of brings me to, two things. One, how do you feel about Eric Bieniemy being the running backs coach? And two, do you think the Bears draft a running back in this draft? Do they do it high? Do they do it later? Or do they not do it at all? Write it out. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love the Eric Bieniemy hire. Honestly, I think that this is a name that I've been following along with for I can't even since probably like 2018 pretty closely, because I remember around that time is when a lot of people he was kind of getting in this world of, are people going to hire him as a head coach? And you really started talking about him as either a high up coordinator somewhere or a head coach, and his name was out. And so it was a name that we were talking about here in Jacksonville a lot, quite a bit. And so I followed along with him very decently, and I have a podcast coming out on him probably later this week or this weekend, and so I'll get to know a little bit more of maybe where things went wrong in certain aspects, because that's also what I like to do. And so in the podcast with Dennis Allen, I did the same thing, like what is good, but also tell me what went wrong in the head coaching world for him, because those are things that we're interested in. So I'll do the same for Bieniemy, but I think it's a good fit. I think anytime you have somebody who has experience and at multiple levels, because we do have, a lot of our coaching staff now is young. Obviously, we know Ben Johnson's young, Declan Doyle's very young. So there's a lot of young pieces. And so it is nice to have somebody come in that has a little bit more experience and has been up and down in ranks, and can also, just recently in UCLA with college kids, so can still relate to these young guys that are on the team and that will be drafted this year. I do think that's a positive. And I do think that's kind of like his forte. That running back room is something that he's really, really good at. And you've seen it at almost all of his stops, and how important the running back room is in general. And I do think we've had this resurgence of running backs, and especially this last year. So it will be fun to see what they do, but I'm interested because I think that DeAndre Swift, I don't love, but I do think that they were using him wrong. Also, I don't know, like DeAndre Swift is not going to be someone who's going to like go up the middle and force mixed tackles or break tackles. He's just not that running back. He never has been that running back. So why they were trying to get him to do that ever, I don't know. He's a very horizontal runner, but when he sees green, he's gone. That's just the type of guy he is. And when you don't have a line to help that, it's not going to work. And that's kind of what we saw, that our interior was so bad that there was no way that was happening. And so then when you go into, I just feel like we haven't even seen enough of Roschon Johnson. I was a big Roschon Johnson fan when we drafted him, and I just feel like I haven't seen nearly enough of him. So I don't know if that's the coaches. Maybe there's just not something there that, like, maybe they're not seeing what they want to see out of him, and that's why it's kind of been this back burner. But at the same time, I feel like if that was the case, then they wouldn't have gotten rid of Khalil Herbert last year. So there has to be something where they like him enough where they felt like a DeAndre Swift and Rojo room was enough, but they just didn't handle it very well. So I will be interested. I will say the positive thing about this draft is, like, there are a lot of really good running backs in this draft. I think the Bears can still get one in the third or fourth round that is a very highly regarded running back. And so I do still think you can address the offensive line, the defensive line, and those first three rounds and still be able to get a really good running back in the fourth round. So that is a positive. It's a good year to need a running back.
I love that answer. I couldn't agree more, for sure.
Yeah. And so that's one thing I guess you can be excited about, because I think between free agency and the beginning of this draft, going heavy in the trenches, and then you're still, like I said, we'll be able to get a guy that I think you'll still be able to use. And you can also decide, like, do you want that just full on bowling ball type of running back, or do you want somebody who that, and we're seeing what works in Detroit. So we'll see and Ben Johnson, that is one of the things I'm most excited about, is that Ben Johnson bringing his mind and how he saw Detroit get built and what worked and what didn't work. Bringing that to Chicago is also a big thing that I think is going to be a positive. And it's something I've talked about a lot too when it comes to Ryan Poles. And when I defend Ryan Poles to people, I'm like, what you have to think about is, in his ear this last few years has been a defensive-minded head coach. That defensive-minded head coach is going to tell you he wants defensive players. He's going to tell you he wants Kyler Gordon, and he wants Tyreek Stevenson, and he wants TJ Edwards, and he wants Tremaine Edmonds, and he wants Javon Dexter. And so that's what they did. He listened to Matt Eberflus, because Matt Eberflus is the head coach, and Matt Eberflus is probably telling him, look, if you give me these things, then I'm going to be able to make this defense to where you don't have to worry about the offense. We can slowly develop these quarterbacks, and we don't have to rush them into scoring 40 points. Now you have a guy in Ryan Poles' ear that is an offensive guy that's going to tell you, okay, like, you have a pretty dang good secondary. I think Javon Dexter is something. Let's add a little pass rush somewhere in there, because that is something that really helps Dennis Allen defenses, is like the interior pass rush. So I do see them addressing that. And then now let's focus on the offense a little bit. You have a guy that could be a generational quarterback in Caleb Williams, but you're never going to see that if you don't start building around him. And that is what is going to be in Ryan Poles' ear now. And that's what makes me excited.
Yeah, David, I want to get your thoughts too, but I mean, they did invest in the offense though. I mean, you have a first round trade back for DJ Moore. You have Darnell Wright. You have Caleb. You have Rome Odunze. So they have put,
Ryan Bates did cost a fourth.
Yeah, I think, so that's the thing about Ryan Poles, and that's how I feel. It's like you can make the case to defend him because there's been enough good to where you can lay that out. You can also make the case against him, and that's why it's so 50-50, because you could kind of draw those things up either way. Yeah, Ryan Bates was another thing where it's like, you target this guy for 2 years, and then, he winds up.
That's where I get into
he was a lineman himself. It's like you should be able to evaluate offensive lineman at least accurately. And I'm sorry, David, go ahead.
That's kind of where I fall with that, Ryan Poles being the emotional part of it, and Ian Cunningham always being his balance. I always thought that Ryan Bates was maybe more of a personal move, where he really wanted him at first, and then he got the RFA tag from the Bills, and then they retained him, and then he's like, you know what?
So he's like, I'm going to get this guy.
Yeah, there's nothing going to stop me this time. I'm going to give him a fifth for it. And then the whole time, I believe Mitch Morse got cut 2 days later, who was Ryan Bates's first string position. Why? And you could have just signed him for money, and then you guys got him. And that's kind of where I always stood on that, where you made it personal, Ryan. So a lot of my points too that you guys are kind of talking about is, me and Carl will kind of do a little bit of a mock draft, and my whole thing with Ryan Poles, and I guess it's going to change a little bit, my opinion, if he does get this extension that people like Courtney Cronin are reporting on, because I always felt that this offseason was going to be painfully cookie cutter for Ryan Poles, because I thought that with all the slightly different things that he was kind of doing and trying to move, Tyler Booker, for example, should not be a 10th overall draft pick. However, if you get Trey Smith by some miracle, you put in some center, Tyler Booker is just the most cookie cutter answer that you can get at left guard and just plug and play. I personally just watched him. I'm not a huge fan. I don't know how much of draft stuff you watch, but I like your answer on get a running back later. But I feel like depending on how much Ben Johnson is in Ryan Poles' ear, how empowered now Ryan Poles feels with the contract extension to get creative. It could be a non-creative move
up for Jahmyr Gibbs, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like Ben Johnson trading up for a running back, that's people who feel really secure in their fucking jobs. Yeah. So that's where I worry about Ryan Poles in this offseason. And I do have more to say about the assistant coaches, because Paul and our friend Carl talked about their favorite assistant coaches and coaching moves, because this staff is looking excellent. Not once, Paul, did you guys mention Al Harris, who's my favorite pickup of any of the pickups as assistant coaches right now this whole offseason? You guys did not mention him once, and I was just
lay it out there, man.
I was screaming at the YouTube channel, just being like, Al Harris
combined original content here,
combined with Dennis Allen is just a nightmare matchup with exotic 4-man blitzes, not even blitzes, but just 4-man stunts, and linebackers just pushing on one side of the line, 2 guys dropping back, and then you get these corners who we already have that are good, and now they get to play aggressive and wait till Cam Jordan gets here because he's coming. And then you get to throw all this stuff in. But that's back to the Ryan Poles thing of it all. I don't know how much you follow into the draft about the Bears specifically, but I see these mock drafts like Daniel Jeremiah, Tyler Booker at 10. And I'm like, man, that's just so goddamn cookie cutter. That's a guy who you should take at 20, at 18. Can you trade back? If you're ballsy and you love a guy, I'm blanking on the name right now, from LSU, forgot his name. Don't quote me on that. But guys like Kelvin Banks or guys that you fall in love with, how empowered are you going to be to make that move versus you're going to take Tyler Booker at 10 just to fit that cookie cutter in your needs rather than like be risky and go for stuff.
Is it Will Campbell?
Will Campbell. Thank you, from LSU.
Yeah, so for me, the unfortunate part with this draft from the people that I have talked to, and I haven't fully got into my draft stuff yet, usually right after probably late February, I start doing a series where it's like, okay, who could the Bears draft at 10? And then I'll go on and beyond the 10 pick. And I'll talk to people from all over that cover different schools and get a little bit more into it. But what I've talked to about the just kind of basic of this draft from people is that it kind of sucks this year to pick in the top 10. There's nobody, maybe outside of Travis Hunter, that people feel are true blue chip players. So draft what you need is what a lot of people are telling me at this point. Like, if your biggest need is a left guard, go get that left guard, because at this point in that top 10, you're not going to be getting anybody that is at least what we've seen in these last couple drafts. And so that could change. We have the combine coming up and stuff like that. And so maybe people start kind of sprouting a little bit more. I was talking a lot about this Dennis Allen. And so the podcast I just dropped part of it's on Dennis Allen, and I talked to Ross Jackson that covers the Saints and that, but then I also talked to Mickey Spagnola, who covers the Cowboys, on Al Harris. And I agree with you. I love this. I feel like the secondary, who I already think is pretty good, is going to be so fun to watch with Dennis Allen and Al Harris. And then you put in, who I actually like, Bill Johnson, on that defensive line, who pretty much was a big part of who Aaron Donald is and the development of him. And that's the type of defensive line he likes too. Those big, like, kind of burly guys who I think Javon Dexter and Andrew Billings fit into. So I do think it will be interesting to see that. And so, like, if in some crazy world Mason Graham is still there, like, get him. Like, that is somebody that I'm like, in a heartbeat, go grab someone like that, because that is just, and I know everyone's going to be like, oh, we still need offensive line. That is a can't miss, especially in a Dennis Allen defense, of somebody that's going to fit and mesh so perfectly in how he does. Because to your point, he does a lot of 4-2-5. He loves the three corners. Obviously, Kyler Gordon's going to be a huge part of this defense. So it's going to be really fun to see what he does with him and sending Kyler in the pass rush, because he likes to use his nickel slot corners to go after the quarterback a lot. And then he uses those safeties too. We talked a ton about Kevin Byard and Brisker said he's cleared, so hopefully Brisker's good next year, because those two together in this secondary too, I think, are going to be huge playmakers. So I think you do have to this year say the trenches are important. You have to focus on the trenches. And so at that 10th pick, unfortunately, it might be a little boring. And I think that when we were in that draft where you drafted Darnell Wright, a lot of people got real angry that it wasn't Jalen Carter. But if we didn't get Darnell Wright that year, we would have been sitting here like, okay, now we need 4 offensive linemen, because there's nobody. And like, some people don't even really like Braxton, honestly. I do. I think Braxton's feasible. Can it be better? Yes. But I do think you have 2 tackles that you can trust, but the whole interior needs to be gutted right now, especially since it looks like they're not re-signing Tevin. So I do agree with you.
I was going to ask if you overpay and re-sign Tevin.
What's
your value? What's your top value on him? Like, what would you think would be the most?
I know it's so hard, because I love Tevin Jenkins. This is also an emotional thing, because I love Tevin Jenkins as like a person. And I think he fits the mentality of, like, he'll defend the quarterback, but he's kind of like goofy and fun. He's really good when he's healthy, but there's no way I'm paying $12 million to a guy who hasn't been able to play one season. And that's what it's projected at. Yeah. I could see like an 8-9, like maybe 8 or 9. I don't know what Tevin is willing to do. I don't know what other teams will think. I don't know if teams are going to look at this and be like, this guy's battle. And it's not one thing. It's different injuries constantly that he's having to deal with, and concussion this last year. So it's scary. There's a lot of things kind of going on. So maybe other teams are telling them, like, maybe if he does kind of listen around a little bit and they're like, no, we're not going to give you that, maybe he'll take a little less. I don't know. But even if that's the case, you still have to try and address it, because the chances are Tevin's not going to be there all game. And these last 2 years, you've had 14, 15 different formations on the offensive line because guys couldn't stay healthy, and you can't keep surviving that way.
Yeah,
sorry, I just wanted to hit this real quick so there's no confusion for Carl in the chat. Dennis Allen didn't cross over with Aaron Donald. Bill Johnson, our defensive line coach, defensive assistant, was his defensive line coach in
LA. Yeah, the Rams.
So that's where the crossover is there. But
David
Taylor made me feel a lot better about picking at 10, I guess, right now. So
I guess
I'm sorry it's gonna be boring, but
if you're gonna just pure draft strategy alone, if you're going to pick top 10, you better be as close to it being a for sure thing as you possibly can. Like this player has to work out and sign another contract here, because when that doesn't happen, when they're only here through the rookie contract, regardless of what position it is, it hurts. It hurts a lot. You know what I mean? So I always say the draft is kind of a crapshoot for all teams, especially when you go back and look through drafts. You can pick any team and improve their draft strategy with hindsight, So there's always gems throughout it all. So I'm one that's usually in a pretty conservative thought of trading back, getting more picks. Last year, I thought was a good example of that, where, you didn't have a single defensive player taken until pick 16.
Yeah.
So you could have dropped back, acquired another pick, had your pick of the litter at defense, and still picked up a center with the additional second round pick that you got.
Draft will never, we and you are not,
crazy.
Paul and I are not combine draft, college gurus, but everybody that we thought was going to be a good player, and we were just blown away by that whole draft, just watching Leatu Latu fall to 15, and then like Jared Verse fall to like whatever it was, 19. And we're like, guys, I'm sorry to break it to you. I don't care how late they were drafted. The first or second best defensive player taken at 19 is a good fucking value.
Yeah, you can't tell me that one of these guys isn't going to pan out. You know what I mean? It's your job to go out and find the right one. But
this is a draft where. Sorry, go ahead, Taylor.
Oh, sorry. I was in love with Jared first. I was like hammering the table, and I wanted Rome Odunze. So I kept saying, like, if Rome's not there at 9, do what you like, draft Jared Verse. And people kept being like, you want to take him at 9? I'm like, yes, like I would take Jared Verse at 9. Give it to me right now. And then obviously the Dallas Turner thing was whatever. And I'm like, but Jared Verse can do all of it. Like he sets the edge so much better than what Dallas Turner can. He can still get to the quarterback. And so watching Jared Verse this year, I'm like, I knew he was going to be a stud. I knew it.
That was he was just the most balanced player in that whole draft. He was good he could get you a mediocre pass rush, get you 10 sacks, plus like set the edge on runs and stuff. I hate to break it to Oxy Brodone. Abdul Carter's not making it past 2. So yeah, don't even entertain 10. Well, what I'm watching so far, and like I've focused so far, I've watched like 5 hours of just basically offensive linemen so far. Okay. And I watch these guys and I'm just like, you're basically drafting Braxton Jones.
Yeah.
They're like borderline undersized, really good technicians, really good hand placement. They're clever, but they're not like physical beasts and stuff like that.
Yeah. So you're saying just wait until the 5th round.
Well, so me and Paul are big proponents of like we grew up on Bill Belichick and stuff like that. So we're just always like, this is probably the best draft to ever go back. Somebody wants Ashton Genty at 10, and you can get down to 18 and pick up a 3rd round pick, and now you have 4 picks from 18 to 58. Like that's the dream this year. Because I think part of the reason is like, yet again, we need to pump the brakes. Paulie and I, if you've ever seen our channel, we're much more of you can call us negative, but we're realistic people on Bears fans. Like this is a Bears fan because we love them. But last year when people are saying 5,000 yards for Caleb, everyone's 1,000-yard receiver, 14-3, we were like, we're struggling to get to 9-8.
Yeah.
And we were called haters and stuff like that. And then
just reminded me too of I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, just to wrap up that point is like, I think because right now, if you're not riding the Ben Johnson wagon right now and this coaching staff, I'm sorry to break it to everybody. Next year's not the Super Bowl year. Yeah. If it's maybe in 2 years, this is the year you go and get 5 guys that this coaching staff can coach up for the following year. Yeah. That they get to home grow and get as moldable pieces and not just fix this overnight because people are like, well, we should take Ashton Genty at 10 because that'll fix all the problems. It's like, guys, what are we talking about here? What are we you getting a running back at 10 with who? Who's blocking for him?
That's why I'm saying that's why I'm saying that Tevin Jenkins has leverage in the situation. Although, like, I've heard that number 8-9 million thrown around. It's just somebody else is going to pay him more.
I'm going to tell you one thing, Paulie, right now. Tyler Booker,
if you're getting 12.
Absolutely.
Yes. So like the top guards in this league are getting paid what, 20? More north of 20. So like, David, I know you mentioned there was a guard on Miami that like they signed his contract. They knew he was only good for 12 games. I forget his name, but and that's kind of what this is. I think like 12, 13, if you can do it for 3 years, guarantee like a year and a half of it, or 2 years of it, I don't think that's the worst deal based off the situation you're in. I mean, you need some type of continuity here.
Yeah.
You can't just sit there and go into it with all rookies. You're still going to need to, overpay somebody else in free agency
We're
for it
definitely
too.
going to.
So I don't think, at the end of the day, I don't think that couple million for what it brings you, I think, even though he's not going to survive all season, I think it may be worth it. I think you could waste money in the NFL a lot worse ways than
where I
overpaying
see this going, and I
that
see
guard.
the realistic part of it because it's so cookie cutter, and this is kind of what I've been alluding to with Ryan Poles. And God bless George McCaskey for genuinely just handing over a blank checkbook this offseason. I think if you have never seen us, Taylor, I am maybe George McCaskey's biggest hater. I make fun of him almost every episode.
I get it.
And like, props where props are due. Blank checkbook and leave. Because I would love to know the financials of this coaching staff. It's probably one of the most expensive coaching staffs in the league, period. But realistically, in the NFL, it's the only place where there's no cap. Cap. So you can get a competitive advantage if you're willing to spend the money on coaching. And right now, I think people are starting to feel that with the Bears. And so, with
part of the issue last year with Cliff Kingsbury, you couldn't bring him here because you'd have to pay him
more money than he wanted more money than Eberflus is making. So it was kind of like, how are you going to pay the second in command more than the head coach? So props to George.
Which I know Ben Johnson was making more than Dan Campbell too before this last season. So that may have been like a hesitation last year too, because I know there were rumors that Ben Johnson was interested in Chicago last year. They ended up keeping Eberflus. So I wonder how much of it was too that they're like, well, he's making more than Dan Campbell. Are you ready for that? And George being cheap, I'm with you. Believe me, I've bashed George McCaskey so much and for so long. And so the day when the news broke, when the Bears got Ben Johnson, we had like a breaking news podcast, and I just started by clapping. I was like, good job, George, because I didn't think you were going to do it. I really didn't.
Yeah, David said the quote of the day. I'm going to name an episode of this. It's going to be the Summer of George. Yes, I love it.
Seinfeld reference if you're a Seinfeld fan.
Yeah, I love Seinfeld.
But no, like and this is where we're really going to see if George is going to follow through on the Summer of George, because if Trey Smith does hit free agency, and you can ask our friend Carl, Ryan Poles might have been playing 4-dimensional chess, letting Matt Eberflus, hang himself with his own petard this whole season so that he can, because again, I don't think any of this happens if Matt Eberflus goes 8-9 this season. I don't think any of this happens. George McCaskey needed such a catastrophe and to get bullied so hard for him to do this. He needed to go home and cry after people are telling him to sell the team. And so we're going to see how much George follows through on the Summer of George. And if Trey Smith somehow reaches free agency, that's going to be my okay, I'm done. George, you win. I'm done. If you're willing to pay a guard 25 million, I think that's a sign of things to come. I wouldn't be surprised much if there is some sort of guard swap with Kansas City. If we get Trey Smith, they're a rehab team for Tevin Jenkins. Hey, Tevin, we need 12 games out of you. Here's 14 million plus incentives. I wouldn't be shocked by something like that. And it's just like a guard swap. I'm not saying for draft compensation or anything. And I don't think the Chiefs are dummies. I think they'll probably, like our friend Carl says, they're going to franchise tag him. They're going to get something for him. But if you could get Tevin Jenkins in a second over there for Trey Smith for $24 million, I'll take that.
Yeah, I know a guy named Eric Bieniemy that's definitely going to be like, hey, if Trey Smith's available, go get him. Yeah,
and that's part of my cookie cutter point is everything is just so laid out. Trey Smith was teammates with Darnell Wright for 2 years on Tennessee. Yeah. Eric Bieniemy was his offensive coordinator and one of his first mentors. Yeah. He's a running back coach now. I mean, again, I think the Bears and Ben Johnson and what Ben Johnson is proving is the Bears are kind of becoming that destination, which is crazy to say. I think Ben Johnson, thank God we got him, because people are choosing to come here. I didn't see this coming one bit. One of my biggest questions that I had on Ben Johnson, because Paul and I, from the very beginning, we were Mike Vrabel guys.
We don't want to keep you here past the clock either, so if anything is going to have to be the last. I mean, I don't know if you have much more time left, but if you have to go at any point, just let us know. And
I'll say a few more. It's okay. Yeah, I'm on the East Coast, so it's a little later, and I have to get up crazy early because I work in radio. So
for
no,
sure.
We'll be quick. Just Vrabel guy, and then Ben. We were Vrabel guys, and then when we got Ben Johnson, my biggest question was, what are his ties in the NFL and can he put together a coaching staff? Because he is like a one-stop guy. He was just in Detroit. He doesn't really have that kind of lineage or coaching tree to build a coaching staff. And that question's been answered. There is still one. None of these guys have ever worked together before. I need people to kind of pump the brakes on that part too. You are assembling the assistant coach Avengers here. Like none of them have ever done it together. None of them. Like there's no overlap with any of these guys. So there's part of like my, that's a great name. Part of my worry with Ben Johnson. But I think, again, the cookie cutter part is like Trey Smith is lined up for you. If he hits free agency, you better go get him. Tyler Booker, I'm going to tell you right now, is an upgrade over Tevin Jenkins. He's just about as solid. There's definitely little bits of things that I didn't really like, but yeah. So that's kind of my rant on Ben Johnson and the coaching staff and the cookie cutter aspect of who we're going to get.
Yeah, it is interesting because since I've started doing some of these coaching podcasts, there's not overlap of these guys, but what it is Dan Campbell's time in New Orleans has like sprayed this tree. It's kind of like formed this tree of guys from the Saints, and that's what it's led to. And I think that Dan Campbell, all of the connections and people that he worked with when he was in New Orleans, excuse me, and since that time it's now kind of started sprouting into all of these other things because there's multiple guys now that have been in New Orleans at different times, but still they're at some point working with Sean Payton, and then Sean Payton takes Declan Doyle with him to the Broncos. Bill Johnson was there a while ago, obviously. And so there is that weird now like pipeline with the Saints, but I'm not mad about it because it was both all of the things when you start to connect with Dennis Allen, with Bill Johnson, with Declan Doyle's time there. They all have these kind of, at the time when they were focusing on this position groups, it was some of the best position groups that they were coaching at the time. So it's fun to kind of look at those connections of, there's not overlap, but if Dan Campbell's the person that's kind of starting to sprout this new tree almost in a way, I'm here for it.
Yeah. And it's definitely that, like, there's a lot of Sean McVay offense in this entire league, and Ben Johnson's kind of just doing, kind of like his own thing in a way. And it's interesting. And so, one of the things that I heard, Rex Ryan say, he said, I'd hire him over me. He's like, and I think I'm pretty damn good. He's like, but this guy might be something else. And so that was nice to hear from a guy who, I personally, I like his opinions, and I want Vrabel too, but looking at it now, I don't know if Vrabel would have been able to put as good of a coaching staff together as Ben Johnson has done. And so that's something that's definitely shocked me. I didn't think that, he was going to do it, but I did hear him say in an interview that this last year did help him prepare a lot and help him plan out what exactly his program is going to be like, and kind of try and think things through a little bit and not rush it. And that might've been, the best thing overall, because it looks like, he had some things in place already for the wheels to start turning as soon as the season was over.
Yeah.
Also, I think it's a credit for him to know where his weaknesses are as a first-time coach and all that stuff. And he's hiring a lot of former players and former head coaches and guys who've been around the block before, which I think is a massive thing, because not every team is in a vacuum. Like what worked for Dan Campbell and the rah-rah stuff and bite kneecap stuff with those specific groups of players is definitely what's going to work. But even if it was Dan Campbell 1-for-1 coming to Chicago, I don't know if that transfers. So maybe like Ben Johnson is just kind of being a little bit more cognizant of, I need to just kind of feel this out from the beginning, bring in people who can help me fill in my gaps and kind of go from there, which is yet another like props to Ben Johnson. Like it's a hard thing for people to know where their weaknesses are and what they need help with. And it seems like he's very much getting those people.
Yeah. And one of the things that I talked about too in my recent podcast was that I do feel like Ben Johnson is hiring people too that he knows already mixes with the personnel that the Bears have now. So he's thinking like, okay, and this is an example of like the Dennis Allen, Al Harris, Bill Johnson. When it comes to the defensive side of the ball, the players that they have, when it comes to a Javon Dexter, when it comes to a Brisker, when I just talked to Ross Jackson, I mentioned about the Saints, and he said Brisker was somebody that they wanted very badly. The Saints were after Brisker in the draft. That was one of the guys they wanted to draft. Bears drafted him 1 pick before Alontae Taylor, who the Saints ended up getting. But Brisker was who they had their eyes on and went 1 pick before. Dennis Allen was a huge fan of Jaquan Brisker. Dennis Allen was a huge fan of Kyler Gordon. He mentioned that, one of the first players he mentioned when he got here. And Dennis Allen was a huge fan of Javon Dexter. So these are three players that Ben Johnson's probably talking to Dennis Allen is like, what do you see in this defense that you like? And Dennis Allen's naming players that he wanted to draft already that fit the scheme and everything he can already do. And so that's what's positive too, because I feel like we're looking at this. They're bringing people in here that already mesh, and you're not going to have to go and change everything as a whole. They are coming in here knowing what players they like and how they build around that. And yes, you're going to add other pieces, and there's definitely some holes to fill, but at the same time, there's a foundation. And I think that Ben Johnson wants to bring people in here that appreciate and know this foundation is something that they can build upon rather than having to like destroy and start over.
One thing that I've always thought about is like, one of the things you can't medically prove is if somebody has a headache or not. I could tell you I have a headache, and you can't really prove it or not prove it. And so, like, that Jaquan Brisker concussion, I've never seen anything keep a guy out that long. Do you think his real concussion was Matt Eberflus? Like, that's really what, at the end of the day, he was just like, I'm not, I got a headache.
A lot of people said
it. I can't come back. I mean, every guy in the league's got a headache at this point. They all just bash their heads in, right? But hopefully he comes back healthy and is able to sustain that health, and that's not an issue moving forward.
Yeah.
Like, that's not an actual medical thing, because he was out for
it was a long time. Yeah.
Long time. Yeah.
Well, because it was like 4-5 weeks he missed maybe, and then they put him on IR after that. So it was a long time, and it was scary, because when you hear those ones about anything brain, you start kind of freaking out, or if you hope it's not neck or something like that. And so those are scary. From what I've seen, he's posted a lot on Twitter saying he's been cleared for a while. He's good to go. He'll be fine. So we'll see what that looks like, because Jaquan Brisker is a difference maker when he's out there. So you definitely want him to be able to return, especially what it looked like with him and Byard early on in the season. It looked like it was about to be a lot of fun. So it kind of sucked when he got hurt. And I think some of the guys like an Elijah Hicks stepped in decently, but it's not a Brisker.
Yeah, I actually felt like he had hit. I'm sorry, David, listening. I actually felt like he had hit a wall last year. And going into this year, I wasn't sure if he was going to, be able to keep progressing. And he did early on. He made some plays in the first 4 weeks that were pretty impressive. Sorry, go ahead, David.
Oh, no. Talking about what you were saying, I think what we saw with Jaquan Brisker was you can't have two wild cards in the back there. Mm-hmm. And Eddie Jackson, what we were always commenting about was that Eddie Jackson was trying to play the wild card game, which forced Brisker to be that safety blanket and make sure he's that last line of defense, which is not his game at all. Yeah. And then now Kevin Byard being just this like super stable, free safety, rangy safety that can be that last blanket of defense. And then it allowed Jaquan Brisker to just start, going balls to the wall, just doing what he's good at. It is a weird concept though with this Dennis Allen year and kind of how it overlaps though, because I've been thinking about it of, we talked about it last offseason. Do you re-sign Kyler? Do you re-sign Jaquan? And it's such a prove it year for both of them that I kind of worry about how this is all going to gel and shake out, because it's always good to have good years, but I don't know, going into this offseason if you had asked me if any player was like the least reliable, I wouldn't want to, and maybe we could find a replacement for it, probably be Jaquan Brisker, as much as I hate to say it, because he's just not been consistent enough and healthy enough and all that stuff. So I do hope he's good. But I feel like it's such a prove it year for him. It's kind of a shame.